So let's turn to your column in this week's magazine, Andrew, largely focused, as we said, on Shabana Mahmood. Now, can you give us a gist of what your column is saying?
So Shabana Mahmood, a really, really interesting figure in the government, partly because almost everyone on the right of politics is bigging her up as the next Prime Minister, and quite a lot of people inside the Labour Party as well. Less well known to the public at the moment, but very straight talking and very clear thinking in her attitude to the biggest problem of all, apart from the budget, which is the borders and the migration problem. And I think what's interesting is pretty clear now that she has a radical and dramatic plan to try to cut the number of people coming across into the UK, across the Channel and elsewhere. And she's going to be going for the European Convention on Human Rights, Articles 3 and 8. She's going to be going for the Refugee Convention and lots of the rest of the human rights law. In other words, she thinks there are things that have been misused and have been so distorted since they were created in the 40s and 50s that they need to be looked at again. Now, this is interesting because, as we know, the government is led by a human rights lawyer, former human rights lawyer.
Yes.
And whether he has buy-in, we don't yet know. He's very, very close to the Attorney General, Richard Hermer, the genial, very, very persuasive character, very, very close indeed to Keir Starmer. So there's that issue. And then there's the issue of what happens if she gets Keir Starmer's buy-in when these matters get to the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party. I think this is going to be the great row that we're going to see over the next few weeks and months.
Right. So let's start with the first point you made then. It almost sounds there like a battle for Keir Starmer's ear between his Home Secretary, the person he has promoted and presumably has put a lot of political capital into to try and solve this issue, and his friend, Lord Hermer. Now, if they're battling for his ear, how are we supposed to judge from the outside who is going to win that battle?
We'll know in the end because of what the government proposes to do in looking again at reshaping Articles 3 and 8 of the ECHR. That will be the first indication, and what they want to do on the Refugee Convention. Now, these are very, very emotional issues across the Labour Party, but you're absolutely right. If you think that, Shabana Mahmood, somebody said to me, the entire reshuffle, the timing was caused by Angela Rayner's leaving government, but the actual reshuffle was completely based around Shabana Mahmood going into the Home Office. That is the single thing that Starmer and those around him most wanted to do.
You know, it's difficult, though, isn't it, to try and understand what this government is trying to do, because as you say, you have a human rights lawyer as Prime Minister, and his friend's an eminent human rights lawyer, who is close to him and is urging him, do not throw away this inheritance, this great inheritance that we have. And if we look at what Article 3 and what Article 8 say, we're talking about the prohibition of torture and inhumane and degrading treatment or punishment. Now, that is, we want to maintain that.
We do. The inhumane and degrading punishment part is the part that the government and Home Office officials say is being misused time and time again by judges and by courts, because people are saying, you can't send me back to my own country's prison system because that would be degrading and inhumane, even with countries where you wouldn't normally assume that to be the case. Yeah. So I think that's the specific problem that they're looking at there.
And Article 8 is the unqualified right to a family life.
Family life, where again, I think Shabana Mahmood would say we're now in a situation where if you are a refugee from, shall we say, from Eritrea, and you come here, it would be easier for you to get your family to come and settle in Britain than it would be for a British person who had married a French person to get their family. So in other words, migrants are being privileged through this over British citizens.
Now, why has this not been done before then? I mean, this is the thing that I think Shabana Mahmood herself is being pressed on by colleagues and advisors. You say, OK, we've had a Conservative government for 14 years. If it was as simple as reforming the ECHR, Articles 3 and 8, why wouldn't it have been done already? Have you got the support for this legally, politically and diplomatically in Europe to do what you want to do?
I think what's changed from the Conservative years is the scale of migration coming into the whole of the EU as well as Britain. And Shabana Mahmood can look around her and say, actually, what I'm saying, what I'm worried about is exactly what the Danes are saying, the Dutch are saying, the French are saying, the Germans are saying, the Italians are saying. And in most cases, these are other governments, a bit like ours, looking over their shoulder at the possibility of a populist right-wing insurgency if they don't change the law as it stands. In other words, either we make the relatively modest alterations now, which will be difficult and controversial, or else the entire structure of these laws will be swept aside within a few years.
And that's the great political argument that is unfolding before us. And I think there is another element to that, which is we have the Labour Party making that case that if we don't reform, we die, effectively. And the other argument is the only way to reform this is through diplomatic negotiation. So it's through cooperation with our friends and allies in Europe. Now, that, I think, is an argument that Starmer is going to be much more comfortable with and is going to be making. And it creates a dividing line, obviously, with reform. And I think you get elements of this now when you hear the Lib Dems and others on the left saying the small boats crisis are the Brexit boats. We didn't have this problem before we left the European Union. And this is a part of a kind of isolationist trap. The more we go down this road, actually we're not going to be able to solve it. I think you're starting to see that kind of argument coming out of Number 10.
Yeah, and there's a lot in it. I think we've got a piece in the New Statesman this week which points to that. I was talking to Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Commission, this week, and he said, all your friends, your Farage people, said that get out of the EU and we can completely secure our border. That went well, didn't it? Was his. I paraphrase.
Yeah, I mean, I do worry though that what we are seeing, if we sort of pull the camera back a bit here, is a drift to the right. I mean, you mentioned it on the podcast last week about a general drift over the past sort of 20, 30 years, drifting to the right. Are we not seeing that essentially in government? So we have elected a Labour government with a landslide, with a 170-odd seat majority. And what we're getting is a drift to the right. Meanwhile, Labour is losing votes to its left.
And I think the reason we're seeing that's exactly what I think. The reason we're seeing it is because nobody's entirely sure of the way to challenge the reform insurgency, up to 30-odd points in the polls at the moment. And I think there's a really, really interesting division inside government, at the heart of government, going on about this, because if you like, the traditional blue Labour answer is there is a real problem with illegal migration. There's a real problem with legal migration, the scale of it. Those voters who are worried about it are right. They're not racist. We understand them. And therefore, we are going to take measures which will so ameliorate the situation, cut down the number of legal migrants, and by and large prevent or radically cut down illegal migration so that those concerns will have been resolved by the time of the next election.
Yeah.
That's strategy one.
Yes.
Strategy two, you heard in Keir Starmer's conference speech in Liverpool, which is absolutely thump Nigel Farage as hard as you can on the nose for being a racist, for being a really, really dangerous character. We have to fight him. We have to confront him. And you could hear Keir Starmer sort of unbuttoning, as it were, and enjoying himself and being in his comfort zone as he really went for Farage and reform. But it's very, very difficult at one and the same time to say this person is a bestial, racist and awful, and we agree with his policies, or we're going to mimic his policies. You can't have it both ways.
I mean, that's a political strategy, right? I suppose you could think back to Tony Blair, that speech he gave in Dover. I think it was in the 2005 election, where Michael Howard, the Conservative Party leader at the time, has released a poster saying, "Are you thinking what we're thinking?" And everyone knows exactly what they're thinking, and it's to do with immigration. And Blair decides, I have to go and take this on.
Dog whistle politics.
Yes, and he goes to Dover and he delivers a speech where he says that what they're saying is wrong. But I think when you read that speech, he's also saying, I am taking action on the border. So he is trying to do what Keir Starmer is doing, to trying to have it both ways.
In much easier circumstances, I think we can say, because the scale of migration was much, much lower. It was much easier in the Blair years. We may not have been in Schengen, we were inside the EU, and there was a lot of EU migration coming in, but the scale of the issue was much, much smaller than it is post-Brexit. So it was easier for him. But you're absolutely right. What was absolutely crucial is to make the distinction between, for instance, the reform policy policy of deporting hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens who've had indefinite leave to remain, who have been here for years, sometimes decades, building businesses, paying taxes, being law-abiding, sending their children to our schools and all the kind of family networks around who are our neighbours, grabbing them, deporting them, forcing them to leave the country, which seems to me to be a recipe for huge disturbance on the streets of Britain and very, very dangerous and in many cases racist as well, on the one hand, versus looking again at indefinite leave to remain and what you have to do to get that, ensuring that people can speak English, learn English properly, abide by the law, saying that if you break the law, then you lose your rights, those kinds of things. Now, one is a reaction to an increasing issue inside the country, which you can argue has progressive aspects. If progressives don't control the borders and don't control migration, other people will come in and do it for them. And the other goes beyond the pale. And I think that making that distinction is not easy. Because I've just been talking about it, and it's quite a complicated thing to get in your heads, but it's absolutely crucial, and the government have to find clear language to do that. They
also have to deliver. Right? This is a perennial theme now when you think about this government. They make this argument that if we don't deliver, then a bad thing will happen. Bad people will come in and they'll do far worse. And so therefore you have to stick with us. I know you, and what Shabana said in her speech, I'm going to do things that you don't like, but you have to let me, so that you'll get the things that you do like. But what are those things that the left like? Where are they coming? What are they? And I think when you press people close to Keir Starmer and you make this point, you say, well, A, you've got to deliver, and at the moment it doesn't look like you are, and B, you've got to give the left something that would be good for them, that they want, and what is that at the moment? I don't think it's clear.
It's not clear, but bits of it are clear. You have to give people a national health service that actually works for everybody.
Yes.
You have to give people a social care system. More and more people are really scared about their later old age. You have to give a social care system that is fairly funded. And I think within all of that, you have to have a progressive taxation system, and minimum and legal wages which are effective for people.
Don't you think as well, though, it has to be more than that? Because those are essentially fixing the things that we once had. We can remember a time when the NHS worked and the schools seemed decent and they weren't crumbling and they weren't falling down and old people were treated with dignity and we had a progressive taxation system. Those are all memories within our lifetime. And so just getting back to something that we had, what you need is also something to hope for, something that's going to be better. And partly Wes Streeting gave a vision of that with the online health service.
I think that's true up to a point, though. I have to say, I think we were in such a difficult position in this country that the prospectus, we're going to take you back to 1995 or we're going to take you back to 1984, would actually be very, very appealing to an awful lot of people. It'll be as good as it was then. Your car will be the same. Your house will be the same. Honestly, I think a lot of people would go for it.
That's quite damning, I think. But it's true.
That's how far down we've come. I mean, that's the trouble.
I think that's true. But I also think if that's only where we get to, the reality will be, well, my life has moved on in so many ways. So if I get a letter from the doctor saying, arrive at this appointment, great, okay, I turn up and I get the appointment. But you also want it on your phone. You want to be able to book things. Yeah. Like the world has moved on. But you said something earlier, Andrew, that sort of jumped out at me. You said that Keir Starmer had returned to his comfort zone in a sense, and it was sort of letting Keir be Keir.
And he was saying after the speech, that was the real me. That was me.
Yeah. So, and you get this sense throughout his premiership that he is saying things that he doesn't quite believe in. He's not quite comfortable, and then he sort of apologises for the Island of Strangers speech, and then he says what he really means, which is, I don't like Nigel Farage, I hate everything he stands for and he's awful. And then you suddenly go, oh, that sounds authentic, that sounds like you. And people sort of roundly applaud him in the audience, and he's widely seen to have had a good conference. Now, Kemi Badenoch did something similar this week. She said, I'm going to get rid of stamp duty, and the crowd loved it. And it felt to me that both were in their comfort zone. And just thinking aloud here, but Nigel Farage has made a policy of getting rid of the two-child benefit cap. That is a sort of confounding thing to hear from him. He is going to spend more on welfare and move his party to the left economically, or so he says. Now, we could say there is therefore one leader of a political party who is seeking to extend his coalition into people that don't normally vote for them, and two party leaders who are just seeking to protect what they have.
Yeah, I think all those positions are dangerous in different ways. I mean, I think Kemi Badenoch's problem is she can say, I'm going to abolish stamp duty. And the country said, yeah, if you became prime minister, you would, but you're not going to become prime minister. Yeah. Very, very small number of people think she'll ever be prime minister. But for Nigel Farage, I think there are real dangers here. I mean, he is leaning left quite clearly on welfare policy, on aspects of economic policy, on aspects of nationalisation. The Tories have picked up on that very effectively, I think. And the real question comes is if we hit another big economic crunch of some kind, if we have an AI bubble bursting and we're suddenly really, really in the browns, deep in the brown stuff, do people look around and look at reforms economics and say that's a safe place to go, or do they recoil from that saying it's exciting, it's radical, but it's a bit too much?
I think that's certainly what Keir Starmer and those around him think as well. I mean, they think if they can get through the next 6 months, if they can get through the budget, which Number 10 is really concerned about, if they can get through that, they can get through Christmas, they come out the other side and then they say, look, no more turbulence ahead of the May elections. Come on, we've all got to pull together. And they get through to the May elections and they brief for 3 months that May elections are always terrible for governments. Don't panic. And then they sort of survive. The argument that is being made is that we're still in a decent position. We have a 170-seat majority. Things are slowly
3 years.
3 years. Things are slowly improving. And by the time we get to the next election and we present to the country two options. One, a Keir Starmer-led Labour government that will carry on this path and will protect public finances and slowly improve public services. And that man over there, a lot of the country will hold its nose and vote for either the Lib Dems or the Labour Party. And
boring stability.
Is that? I mean, it's quite depressing that is the kind of limit of our ambition, and it speaks to what you were saying before. But is that a reasonable thing, a reasonable strategy for the government and for the Labour Party itself?
It may sound depressing, but one of the oldest political mottos, of course, is that by and large, fear trumps hope. And I think we are in a fearful period. I think a lot of the electorate are scared. They're scared about their own economic future. They're scared about the borders. They're scared about Ukraine and Russia. They're scared about many things. And therefore, a Labour government offering an element of security government, securonomics, that Rachel Reeves used to talk about as well, might well be the most appealing thing to do. In other words, this may not be the moment for the great visions of the sunlit uplands and the new Jerusalem glittering on the top of the hill.
Yeah.
Maybe too far away from our reality.
Well, we've got two visions of fear, I suppose. We've got sort of economic fear and we've got the fear about the borders. And the central argument that the Labour Party are making is I'll deal with that fear about the border and then I'll make this the next argument about economic fear. Now, Andrew, the fascinating thing reading the news today, this week, the past month, it feels like deja vu. I'm hearing these names that are like memories from the past. We have Peter Mandelson being sacked again for the third time. And we have this week, we have this quite confusing but potentially really quite serious scandal about China and Chinese spies. And at the centre of it, this figure, Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's chief of staff during that entire period of his premiership, and now Keir Starmer's national security advisor. Jonathan Powell has been somebody who, until now, has really been seen as a success story in this government.
Yeah.
He has kept a low profile. He has not appeared in the press like Morgan McSweeney. People don't really talk about him. But now we have this bubbling crisis. And I think it both speaks to the sense of a Blairite return, and there are other figures that you could talk about in a moment, but also a sense of Britain's position in the world and how we don't yet seem to have found a position between China, between the United States, between the European Union, where we feel comfortable. And so we're just sort of damping down these crises that are playing out in the courts.
I think this goes down to the question of what you call a Blairite and what we think Blairism is and was. What it was certainly an optimistic vision of a globalized economy in Britain in a globalized world in which it was our job to really make nice and have better relations with all sorts of the other big players. And I think in all of this, you see that. I mean, Peter Mandelson's job was to go to Washington and make nice with Donald Trump, which he did. Jonathan Powell has been making nice, or at least negotiating and talking to the Chinese Communist Party because China's the other great power in the world. Both of those stories come back to that vision of globalization, which may these days be outdated. I mean, most people would agree that period of globalization is finished and probably gone for good. And so actually we're now, as it were, leveraging our relatively small heft in a world which is much more hostile to a country of Britain's size. And if you look at the spying crisis, in Westminster, two guys who allegedly passed information to Chinese communist handlers about what was going on. It's unclear as to how damaging this information really was or how surprising it really was. But the whole thing hinges on whether in court the government was prepared to describe China as an enemy or an enemy state. And they were not. And that is because, simply because of China's economic heft, they are too powerful economically for us to just casually demonize as an enemy.
And it has this fascinating row between the Public Prosecution Service today, and which of course was led by Keir Starmer previously, and about the sense that the government was just not cooperating. And it essentially did not want this trial to go ahead. So it is, I mean, that is the allegation essentially. It forcibly collapsed the trial.
And if that's true, then the government is speaking with forked tongue because ministers say they're terribly upset the trial has collapsed. It's very unfortunate the trial has collapsed at the same time as the accusation is that they pulled the rug from under it.
Yes. Yeah, I think it goes back to something that you were saying before, Andrew, this sense of kind of nostalgia for a world. If you go back to 1995 when, you know, I'm sure in 1995 it didn't feel simple, but it feels simple today and it feels kind of optimistic today. I read a speech that Tony Blair gave. I think it was in 1998. It may have been in his first conference speech as Prime Minister in 97, in which he lays out this vision of Britain. And he says, the Britain of the 21st century will be a beacon for the rest of the world to follow because we sit in a perfect place. We've got the English language, we've got the time zone, we're in the EU, we're best friends with the United States, we've got a relationship with China. That world is gone. And
in those days, of course, we had the City of London, one of the great financial centres. That was before the financial crash and all the problems that came from that. We boasted about the fact that we had 300 or so different language groups inside London alone. We were the kind of world's island in that regard because we hadn't seen the scale of migration from particular communities that was going to cause the trouble after that. It seems a sort of tangerine-coloured, hazy, sort of glowing, optimistic place compared with where we are now. In retrospect, of course, you can say all those problems were building up. We were just too naive about them at the time.
But then we have those figures that are back in government. And that is the fascinating thing to me. So Tony Blair has gone through this period of sort of ignominy in a sense, in which he was almost a national hate figure. He couldn't appear in public in Britain for, I'd say, it was sort of around a decade after leaving office. He had the Chilcot Review hanging over him that he felt that he needed to get through. He spent more and more time abroad. He looked kind of haggard and also angry with Britain that it had rejected him.
Somebody told me an anecdote about Blair during that period, which seems to me to sum it up perfectly. They were in, I think, Dubai, somewhere in the Middle East, in a very, very posh hotel, one of those great, but not quite the Burj, one of those really, really tall hotels, surrounded by desert, you know, bakingly hot, the sun outside, arid all around. And this guy's going down the lift and passes the hotel gym. And in the gym, by himself, nobody else around him, is Tony Blair on a treadmill, absolutely pounding it.
Yes.
And he's red-faced, pounding and pounding away. My friend goes down, has a drink, has something to eat. An hour or two passes, and he goes back up towards his room, and he passes the same gym, and there is Tony Blair still on the treadmill, still pounding away. And for an image of kind of isolation and self-punishment, I think it beats all others.
It's like that Robert Harris book,
The Ghostwriter.
That's it, yeah. And there's Tony Blair locked away on some kind of North American island somewhere from memory. But I think there's something about that return of Blair, you know. So I think post-Brexit, he emerged back into the public consciousness and in a sense reminded people that he was once a progressive figure.
That period wasn't so bad when you look at it. Put a brackets around the Iraq War if you absolutely insist on doing that. But for most people, during that period, the economy was growing, 6%, something like that a year. Things were really quite optimistic. We were becoming more liberal, more open, more generous-spirited. Those weren't bad times. And I think that sort of nostalgic memory has become stronger for obvious reasons, given where we are now. And I think also he's found a new narrative. It's no longer globalization is the answer. It is AI and tech is the answer.
It's still futurism. It's kind of it's utopian futurism that says, I can see where the future is. And it was once globalization, liberalization, and all of that, and Europe. And now it is tech futurism. Now, I think we can, and we've written about this, that there are questions about the TBI and his relationship with Larry Ellison in particular, but big American tech money.
So, and Palantir.
He certainly has an interest in promoting that. But I think politically it raises a question for us, because it's not just Peter Mandelson and Jonathan Powell. We did have Liz Lloyd, who was a senior figure in the policy department. We have Tim Allen, who is now the new Alistair Campbell, if you like, the kind of director of communications in Number 10. These are figures from the Blair era. And I think it's the challenge to the government, this government, is to say, are you returning to a vision of the past, or are you genuinely able to reflect today's society and the challenges that exist today?
So I think they have Blair-era people all over the place, but they are not Blairite overall. And I think, as it were, the defence for what they're doing is, if you come into government after a long period in opposition, where you don't have many people who understand power, understand Whitehall, understand the wiring and where the levers are, then you have to bring in people from the past. And the only past that there are people still available from is the Blair and Brown years. And therefore, if you want people who are going to be effective, you have to reach out to that period of relatively recent past. That doesn't mean that you accept the entire Blairite globalist agenda, because that's been overtaken by events.
But then I think it does come back to that question, is whether they have any other ideas. So you sort of reach back. I mean, it sort of speaks to a hollowing out of our political class in a sense. I remember being told something very similar during the Brexit years, when this focus moved to Northern Ireland and the border. And there was this sudden realization that post the Good Friday Agreement, the Northern Ireland office had just been hollowed out. We just had lost this kind of institutional memory of what was required to balance the interests in Northern Ireland, to manage the situation, to manage the relationship with Ireland. We kind of institutional hollowing out in Whitehall. And now it seems that there is a kind of political hollowing out. So we have to reach backwards. But is there an ideological hollowing out as well? Is there a sense that we don't know what to do in this situation? So we return to old principles. I think that brings us back to the China case. Because to me, I remember, I wrote a piece about this, thinking about our long relationship with China. And you can see moments of pivot where it looks like we're pivoting towards either a very close relationship under David Cameron and George Osborne. We were supposed to enter a golden era.
Pulling the pint in the Cotswold pub.
That's it.
All of that,
And central to that was making London the central clearinghouse for the Chinese currency in the world, globalizing the Chinese currency through London. That was going to make us rich again. And obviously that collapsed. And then there was the moment where we went in the opposite direction with Theresa May. And we were going to be much harder towards China. We were going to be much more skeptical about Huawei and the introduction of Chinese technology into our industry. And that then changed as well. And we went back to what we've always tried to do, which is to have it both ways, where we're trying to have a close relationship with the Americans and with the Chinese. And I think the question is whether we never changed that policy. That's back to where we are today. We're trying to have it always. Jonathan Powell is a representative of that, and the government. And whether essentially that is no longer tenable in a world of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping and tariffs.
You can't be a sturdily independent-minded butler.
Who are you the butler for, is the question.
Absolutely. And there's a very interesting, great debate going on now about the vast new Chinese embassy being built, or about to be built, if it gets all the permissions it needs, by Tower Bridge, which I think would be the biggest Chinese embassy anywhere in Europe, a massive complex. And there are lots and lots of Chinese dissidents in the UK really scared about what's going on underneath the embassy. Are there going to be prison cells there? Is this going to be a big, Chinese sort of semi-military operation inside the UK? This is very, very intimate and very close.
And indeed, I think Robert Jenrick has come out against it and said this is a test of character. Now, again, so it's a question of sort of the shifting sands of British politics. Are we moving into a direction where we're going to have to choose one side or the other, or will we just carry on fudging it for much longer?